ever been introduced to someone and then like completely forget their name 2 seconds later?
Happens to the best of us.
It's like our brains are playing tricks on us, so why do we remember certain things and completely forget others?
It's a great question. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, the really fascinating world of cognitive psychology.
We're talking about how we perceive information, how we make sense of it all, and how we ultimately use it to build memories.
Yeah, and we've got a ton of fascinating research to explore, classic experiments, groundbreaking theories, all about how our brains take like this jumble of information and turn it into like a coherent picture of the world around us.
One memory at a time.
One memory at a time, exactly.
So like, okay, let's break this down a little bit. Let's say I meet someone new, right? What's going on in my brain when I try to remember their name?
Okay, so picture this. Think of your brain kind of like a bustling city, with different areas for different tasks.
Okay, I like that.
So first, that information, the person's name, it hits what's called sensory memory.
Sensory memory.
Sensory memory. And think of this like the city's mailroom. It's that initial stop for every single piece of information that comes in through your senses.
So like a quick snapshot, the way they look, the sound of their name before it disappears.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Your brain, it doesn't hold on to these snapshots for very long. It has to decide really quickly what's important enough to move to short-term memory.
Short-term memory. So what is that? That's our mental workspace.
Yes, exactly. That's where we hold on to information just long enough to use it for like a task or a conversation.
So that's like the city center, right? Where all the action happens, decisions are made, things get done.
Exactly. You got it. But just like a busy city center, short-term memory, it has its limits. It can only hold on to, a certain amount of information at once.
It's true. It's like my brain can only handle so many tabs open at a time before it just crashes.
Precisely. And that magic number 7, plus or minus 2.
Miller's Law. I always forget names, but somehow I never forget that. So remind us again, what's the significance of that number?
Yeah, so psychologist George Miller, he figured out that our short-term memory, it's like a juggling act. We can only keep so many balls in the air at once.
And those balls are?
Those balls could be digits, like in a phone number, individual letters, or even, and this is important, meaningful groups or chunks of information.
Okay, so instead of remembering a jumble of random numbers, my brain tries to, like, organize them into meaningful chunks, like dates or area codes, which is exactly how those websites get us to remember those verification codes, right?
Exactly. Chunking. Chunking is your brain's way of making order out of chaos. It's saying, hey, I've only got so much space, so let me group things together to make them easier to handle.
Okay, so that makes sense, but here's the thing. Even if I repeat a name in my head, like a million times, trying to keep it in that short-term memory, there's still a chance I could completely forget it. So how do I make sure that those names, those important details, actually transfer over to my long-term memory? That like vast library of knowledge that we're building over our lifetime.
That's where things get really, really fascinating. So it's not just about, passively storing information. Think about long-term memory, less like a library and more like, this giant web.
Okay.
With each memory as a point of light. And every time you make a connection, it's like you're drawing a new thread between those points, strengthening the whole structure.
So the more connections we make, the more durable those memories become.
Exactly. Think about learning a new language.
Yeah.
If you just tried to, memorize vocabulary lists, those words are probably going to just fly right out of your head.
Yeah.
But if you can use those words in a conversation,
yes,
or connect them to a personal experience, or even come up with like a ridiculous story, that's when they really start to stick.
It's true. It's like those words become anchored to something more meaningful. They become part of like the bigger story that we're telling ourselves. But our research mentions these different types of long-term memory. So it's not just one big web, right?
You're absolutely right. Our brains are much more complex than that, thank goodness.
You're absolutely right. Our brains are much more complex than that, thank goodness. So it's more like different neighborhoods in a city, specialized areas.
Yeah, you could say that, each with its own unique function.
Mm-hmm.
So take what's called declarative memory, for instance. That's where we store those facts and events. It's all the stuff that we can consciously recall and talk about.
Okay, so if I know that the capital of France is Paris, or like what I had for breakfast this morning, that's my declarative memory doing its thing. Oh.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it gets even more interesting. Even within declarative memory, we have these subcategories. So like Semantic memory, that's like your vast mental encyclopedia. It's all that general knowledge, all those facts and concepts.
And then there's episodic memory, which is like those personal memories, those events, those like sometimes embarrassing moments that we just can't seem to shake right.
Exactly. So it's the difference between like knowing that Paris is the capital of France and remembering that time you, I don't know, ate an amazing crepe while sitting by the Seine.
Okay, so those remember that time,
Yeah.
stories that come up at every family gathering, that's episodic memory, like taking center stage.
Exactly. It's our own personal highlight reel. Those memories that shape our sense of self and our relationships.
Love it. Okay, but here's something I've always wondered about. What about the stuff we don't even have to think about remembering? Like riding a bike or even just tying our shoes. It's not like we're consciously recalling every single step.
You're talking about procedural memory.
Okay.
That's the how of memory. It's those skills, those habits, those things that are so ingrained in us from practice.
So it's like our brains develop muscle memory, but for actions, like for sequences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, think about that first time you tried to ride a bike.
Oh, I remember.
You're probably thinking about every movement.
So much effort.
But over time, you don't even have to think about it. Your body just knows what to do.
It's true. Which is a good thing, because I think if I tried to think about every single thing I'm doing while riding a bike, I would probably fall over. But how does our brain decide what gets the procedural treatment? Like what we automate and what we don't?
That's something that researchers are still trying to fully understand.
I bet.
It seems like our brains are really good at recognizing those patterns, those things we do over and over. And they're always trying to become more efficient.
So like the more we repeat an action, the stronger those pathways become, and eventually we don't even have to think about it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And, it's not just physical skills either. Think about learning a language.
Right.
At first, those verb conjugations, they feel impossible, like you're trying to solve some complex equation.
Yeah.
But you practice, and then one day it just clicks. You're not even thinking about the grammar anymore. You just know.
You just know. Which is, I think, such a cool thing about the brain. It's this constant interplay between those conscious decisions to learn something and then our unconscious just taking over.
Exactly. We talked about how, like, deep processing, making those connections can strengthen memories. Sometimes our brain just takes it a step further and says, you know what? I'm going to automate this entire process, make it completely effortless.
Yeah.
And that's how we get those ingrained skills and those habits.
So our brains are like secretly working behind the scenes to make our lives easier all the time, just automating everything they can.
Exactly. And that just shows how amazingly adaptable and complex our brains really are.
It's amazing, really. So we've covered these different types of long-term memory, those facts and events, the skills and habits. We talked about how our brains build this intricate web of connections to really make those memories stick. But we've also touched on forgetting, how sometimes our memories fail us. So is there anything we can actually do to improve our memories, make them a bit more reliable?
Oh, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? That is the million-dollar question. And, it's easy to think about forgetting as like a bad thing, a failure. But actually, it's a crucial part of how our brains work.
Really, forgetting is a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. Imagine if you remembered every single detail of every single day.
Well, that would be way too much.
Right. The taste of your coffee, every email, every pigeon you walk past, your brain would be completely overwhelmed.
Yeah, I would be, like, stuck. So forgetting is, what, like a mental decluttering system?
Exactly. It helps us clear out the noise,
Yeah.
make space for the stuff that really matters.
So those times I forget where I put my keys, my brain's just making room for, I don't know, more important information. I can get behind that. But seriously, is there anything we can actually do to, improve our memories, make them a bit more reliable?
Absolutely. That's what's so cool about cognitive psychology. We're not powerless. So one powerful technique is elaboration.
Elaboration.
Yeah, it's basically the art of making connections, building those bridges between new information and stuff you already know.
So we're talking about actively engaging with the information, right? Instead of just kind of like passively absorbing it, trying to make it mean something.
Exactly. It's like instead of just reading a list of facts, you're turning them into a story. You're making them relevant to your own life.
So like if I'm trying to remember a historical date, maybe I could connect it to like a significant event that happened in my own life.
Exactly. Or imagine yourself back in that time period. What would it have been like to be there? The more senses you can involve, the better.
And what about that thing where, like, if you really want to remember something, you should, like, write it down over and over again?
That's definitely one way to do it, but there's actually a more efficient approach called spaced repetition.
Okay, so remind me how that works again.
It's the idea that we're way more likely to remember something if we revisit it, not just once, but multiple times, with increasing intervals in between.
So, like, instead of cramming for an exam the night before, I should space out my studying over, say, a few weeks.
Exactly. Every time you revisit the material, you're basically reactivating those neural pathways, strengthening those connections, and making the information less likely to fade away.
So it's like those pathways become, I don't know, like well-worn trails.
I like that. Well-worn trails instead of these, like, overgrown paths that you can barely even see anymore.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And you know what? This whole deep dive has just like opened my eyes to how much control we actually have over our own memories. It's a skill, right?
Absolutely. And like any skill, you can get better with practice.
That's really encouraging. This has been such a fascinating exploration of the inner workings of our minds.
Agreed. And remember, we're only just scratching the surface here. What we know about memory and the brain is constantly evolving.
That's both exciting and a little bit daunting.
Totally. But that's the beauty of it. There's always more to learn. So stay curious. Keep asking those questions. Keep exploring this incredible world inside your own head.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into cognitive psychology for today. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those mental gears turning.